The Goldenrod Protocols by James Oliver. Copyright 2023.
"Well, it makes sense. They're just so depraved," she babbled. "Can you imagine what it must be like to live in the provinces?" "Oh, of course not." He felt his insides fighting to get out. "I don't even want to think about it." The words felt slimy on his tongue, but he had to step outside himself in moments like this. Patricia was declaring her devotion. It didn't matter whether she was right, only that he affirmed her. Anything else was heresy. "I mean, is that what you want?" she huffed. "You want the state to be like the opposite?" Her hysteria doubled with each flap of her tongue. He'd praised her brilliance and bowed to her in awestruck humility, but it couldn't make up for his initial hesitance. "I would love that," he silently sneered. The words circled his mind like so many others he could think but never say. He could almost taste them as they bubbled up to the back of his tongue. He itched to let them slip, but knew from others' mistakes what would happen if she was as zealous as she seemed. He would be published. He might be erased. She could condemn the rest of his life to perdition. Then again he realized, she thinks your name is Jeff. She might not be able to report him. "No, I can't. It's not worth the risk." He often had little arguments with himself to sort his musings in times of stress. He was fed up with conversations like this, but he'd gotten sloppy lately and had to be more careful. He almost got himself in trouble just 2 weeks before, when he stopped for a beer after work at a bar on 7 East, a trendy strip of bars on the Christina waterfront over the footbridge from his factory. The man sitting next to him intruded with conversation, and Jack let slip a forbidden reflection, to the man's indignation. Jack spent the next 3 days anxiously awaiting his punishment. He got lucky, and it never came, but he couldn't tempt fate again. "I don't know," he muttered. Patricia pursed her lips and turned away. He hadn't affirmed her devotion or given her anything to affirm. It would ruin her day, which gave him some comfort. Subtle subversions loosened a knot inside, even if he could never quite name what he was subverting. But she seemed subdued. He'd narrowly escaped erasure, but his soul had been remanded. He shook her off and gazed at the pristine cities passing below, as he had twice a day for 15 years. By now, his eyes had followed the Southern Spoke Turnpike from downtown Valhalla to Century Park in New Dawn hundreds of times. He'd never been to any of these places, but each day he dreamed of a neo-cosmopolitan life in the gleaming paradises below. These few moments every morning were his chance to imagine a better life. The early morning sun cast an orange glow over the landscape. A few lights still dotted the edges of streets and twinkled from inside homes. Comfortable and cozy homes, he wondered, filled with warmth and joy. Jack imagined friends gathered on patios ringed by Chinese lanterns, sharing laughs and living the kinds of moments that really only happened in movies and pharmaceutical ads. Each morning, the glass veneers on the buildings in the city centers reflected the warm sunlight and awakened his longing. But that only reminded him that he wouldn't be welcomed on the sidewalks the buildings rose from. Then he saw only their cold, hidden concrete cores, and he hated that someone else had built them. He'd always yearned to create something of his own. But the algorithm had other plans for Jack. Every Friday, school children across the Great Republic played a series of fully immersive games to train and assess their behavioral responses. Their scores were fed into a database, and the aptitude algorithm determined the career best suited to their abilities. Jack never did very well. He found the games boring, and his mind took him somewhere else. Every time his shuttle passed over these cities, he remembered sitting on a bench in a waiting room when he was 13, listening in while his mother discussed his scores with his friar. "He scores very low for adaptation," he'd heard the friar say. Jack's mother defended him. "Adaptation? I don't understand. He's very resourceful. When he was a kid, he used to make toys and build things out of whatever he could find." "Well, that's—" the friar sighed. "Jack freezes up when he's faced with a challenge. There has to be a mistake somewhere. There are no mistakes anymore. The blockchain verifies the results thousands of times. And I have to tell you, the models are very reliable. People like Jack, they're afraid of unfamiliarity. They can't understand new ideas." "That doesn't make sense. He's always had such a vivid imagination." "Mrs. Caulder, I know this is hard to hear, but he doesn't have the right kind of imagination. Imagination is useful when it's adaptable. Jack's imagination can't be applied to something collectively beneficial. It's extraordinarily vivid, but it's more like fantasy. something he uses to cope with difficult situations. He doesn't even qualify for social sponsorship. So based on his scores, he's going to be assigned a simple class in the K range. Those words still echoed through the deepest caverns in Jack's mind. The algorithm was woven into the fabric of society around him. His code dictated his salary and his creditworthiness. He had to write it on forms and introduce himself as Jack Caulder, K9184. Failing to do so was considered seditious. "Now arriving at Lenape Square Station," announced the soft, simulated voice over the speakers after a peaceful chime. Patricia gathered her things and shot him a scowl before she left. "I got lucky," he reflected. "I need to be more careful." But the relief was quickly replaced by an anger that would burrow deep in his mind until he couldn't see it anymore. The shuttle glided down toward the top of Lenape Square Station, a towering stalagmite adorned up and down with shuttle platforms like oyster mushroom caps hanging from an oak tree. This was Jack's favorite stop. Most passengers sat next to the windows facing the bay to watch the sunrise over the glistening water. But Jack preferred to look inward, another subtle subversion. Like the other upper line stops on Jack's commute, Lenape Square was built over the ashes left over after the reckoning. The abbeys had erased and replaced the communities that were there before. There was no history of this place. But this stop was special. The shuttle platform was so high above the town he could only see the edge of it. But just past the green zone, the strip of parks and forests separating the Czech towns from the opposite, he could see a legacy town. So mysterious. Jack always assumed they were where the Progs lived, the nameless, soulless janitors, plumbers, and maintenance men who worked in the shadows among the Czechs. But he didn't even know how they got to the metro state. So far as he knew, no transit lines went there. Everyone knew legacy towns existed, but no one ever talked about them. He'd never known how many there were. Legacy towns were enigmas, neither state nor province, blemishes on the landscape, ghosts of a bygone time the public consciousness was content to ignore. And yet, there one was, sparkling under the same morning sun as Lenape Square, like a unicorn atop a distant hill. Jack often daydreamed about the quaintness of these mythical hamlets, far from the watchful eyes and scornful ears of the righteous. But the moment was over. The passengers had boarded and the shuttle was whisking Jack away from his zen. At least today wouldn't be quite as boring as usual. The Labor Department agency that assigned Jack to his company 15 years before had assigned a batch of new employees, and Jack was selected to train them. Normally, his job was to monitor and maintain robots along an assembly line. They said it was important work, but it wasn't. Another robot could have done it. But today, he was the robot, assembling more robots.